5 of that coming up by chance. You multiply that by the 200-plus million I just gave you for the previous odds, we're now up to 1 chance in 45 billion, with a B, that this thing is accidental. In other words, all of these orbital parameters, the numbers, not me, the numbers say, with a statistical, certitude, you could take to Vegas and own the world if this was on your side, that 45 billion to 1, this thing has been designed. The orbit is not random. The orbit is as precise as NASA sending the Cassini spacecraft to Saturn.
Are you saying it's a craft of some type?
It is something. This is where I was several weeks ago. It's something which was sent to us with these specific parameters. Remember, if I go outside, George, in the winter, and you can't do that in Southern California, but in New England you can, and I roll up some snow and I throw it at somebody else, that is a specifically designed trajectory.
Right.
A fastball in Fenway Park is a specifically designed trajectory. The ball is manufactured. The snowball is just natural stuff. But the trajectory, the orbit, has been defined by an artificial intelligence, i.e. a human being.
Sent this way.
Sent this way. So whether Elenin, remember we're talking where I was weeks ago in my thinking, was natural or artificial, meaning it was just a comet or it was a spacecraft, was irrelevant because the numbers prove someone sent it.
Now, why?
Now we get to the weird dichotomy, which Elenin himself will not address, really. He's papering it over on his website. He pretends it doesn't exist.
Nor will NASA address this.
Well, NASA, remember, Elenin discovered the thing, so he's been calculating its orbit separately from NASA. They're both using the same database. In other words, all over the world, there are astronomers, both amateurs and professional, who've been observing this thing night after night after night for the last 8 months, right, taking pictures.
Sure.
They feed them into this central clearinghouse, this database up at Harvard, the IAU Center. NASA takes those observations and calculates, using its computers, an orbit. Elenin in Moscow, with his little laptop sitting out in the parking lot, he did a really cute interview with Russian television. I mean, he's a really nice guy, just a 30-year-old guy who's tickled to death. He's discovered a comet, and he hasn't a guile in the world. He's not in on a plot. He's not part of some super conspiracy. He's just really feeling cool. He's discovered a comet.
Yeah, he just found it.
Idea that something much bigger is apparently going on. He calculates that this orbit of this thing, when he first found it, was not forever, meaning hyperbolic. It was 13,000 years, meaning that's half the precessional cycle of 26,000, right?
That's right.
13,000 years is the last time of Atlantis. It's the last time of the fourth world of the Hopi, of the great transition 13 Baktuns ago of the Mayan calendar. It's the time of Zep Tepi and the ancient Egyptians. It's the last time human beings had really high-tech, cool stuff on this planet in the model until something very bad happened, and we lost it all. We lost almost all those people, and we've been climbing back up the ladder to try to reach for the stars again after 13,000 years. Well, what are the odds, you're going to get tired of me saying this, that this thing, with all these other parameters, could be exactly 13,000 years from the last catastrophe of the Earth?
1 in a zillion?
It's so big that there probably isn't a computer on the planet that could handle it, George. That's why I can say categorically tonight to everybody hanging, I hope, on the edge of their chair, looking at their radios like we used to do when I drove home with my parents from the supermarket.
Gathered around with your family.
Yeah. It is artificial. Elenin is artificial, regardless of whether it's a rock, a comet, or a spaceship.
That it was sent this way.
By an intelligence. Now, my model, which I've discussed on the show before, it is us who sent it. It's our great-great-great-great-great-grandmothers, the folks who survived that last catastrophe, that last huge Atlantean descent into the primeval sea of nothing and oblivion when something awful happened, and they sent to their future descendants a time capsule or an ark or a library or something that would help us now in our time of greatest need as the physics is conspiring to maybe, big maybe, create the circumstances that will do that same thing to the Earth again.
Richard, we're going to come back. We're going to continue talking. We'll try to take a few calls here with Richard C. Hoagland on Coast to Coast AM. Well, on our next Coast to Coast program, split show for you. For the first couple hours, Jim Mars joins us as we talk about his thoughts on how the media twists stories to their own benefit. And then later on, psychic and author Dr. Louis Turry joins us on Coast to Coast, talking about the past and the present and the future. And when we come back, let's take some calls and continue talking with Richard C. Hoagland on Coast to Coast AM. So, Richard, if you think it was our ancestors who have basically launched this comet, what's their message? What do they want us to know?
Well, there are several possibilities for how we would get the message. One is they may have assumed that we would develop technology sufficient that we could go out, like in Arthur C. Clarke's wonderful classic Rendezvous with Rama, and actually rendezvous with Elenin, knock on it, enter some codes, go in the front door, and find everything we need to basically change history. However, as you know, that has not happened. The space program has been moribund for the last 40 years. We went to the moon. They killed Kennedy before that, and we've gone off in totally different directions to where there appear now to be two space programs, one run by an elite with real anti-gravity spaceships, the secret space program that we've talked about on this show many times, and the one using dumb rockets that appears to be coming to an end that wouldn't possibly get anywhere near Elenin because it's moving so fast as it whips around the sun and crosses our bow that you'd never even catch it with a rocket, let alone be able to rendezvous with it. The other possibility is that they were smart enough to realize that history might fragment and that bad guys would continue to take control of the human species, would monitor our calls, so to speak, look at our email, bring up things like the Patriot Act where they can, wind up entering a poor kid's bedroom, 13 years old the other night. FBI guys rush in, all guns drawn, because they think he's part of Anonymous. So if our ancestors were smart enough to realize that history could be hijacked by a bunch of people that do not have the best interests of the rest of the human race at stake, they may have designed programs, protocols into computers on board this thing, whatever it is, and they either could beam radio signals, laser signals, or they could be broadcasting on frequencies in the torsion field that we are not even equipped, except maybe for our accutron measurements, to even detect. I am strongly recommending that any hams or radio astronomers listening start tuning in and pointing their antennas at Elenin, because it doesn't need to be seen to be picked up on radio or even on lasers. The other thing...
you wanted Seth to get some beaming over there.
I'd like Seth, who's gotten...
Shostak from SETI.
Seth Shostak to turn his antennas at Elenin. I mean, what's he got to lose? If he gets nothing, so what?
Oh, I agree. It doesn't cost him anything. No.
I'm challenged. If he's listening tonight, Seth, come on, be a scientist. Listen, do an observation, and then tell us what you hear. If people want to know what frequencies, you know what the classic SETI paradigm has been for years, George? That we've been sending out radio signals. Like I used to tell Walter Cronkite that by the time he had finished the evening news, and then they did the 11 o'clock tiny news feed on the network several hours later, his evening news was crossing the edge of the solar system, the orbit of Pluto, at the speed of light every single night. So we've been broadcasting into interstellar space on radio and television wavelengths for decades. So I would start listening on those frequencies, channels 2, 3, 4, 5, the old UHF and VHF channels, and some of the major ham bands that can get through the ionosphere. Somebody will pick up something if this model is correct and they're using something as primitive as radio or television. Frankly, I think that it's going to be a lot more spectacular. I think that they will set up a system where something happens visually so that Elenin becomes, as a surprise, as a shock, as a kind of a ritualized resurrection, the Hopi blue star.
Now, what if that Norway spiral popped up at the same time?
Well, that could have been a forerunner of what we're going to see, couldn't it?
Maybe. maybe. Yeah.
And there are rumors now that Elenin is disintegrating. I mean, I've been seeing those over the internet.
But you're not a doom and gloomer about this comet.
Well, of course not, because I see too much incredible numerical precision into an incredibly uplifting message. George, what would you say would be the one thing that would free the human race forever from anyone trying to put us into chains? It would be the ultimate understanding of how the universe works, how to create free energy, anti-gravity, immortality. It would free us from elites and banksters and everybody who's picking our pocket and all the corruption we see going on now once and forever, provided that message and that information got to the ordinary folks. It would be a stunning way to change history, and that's what my friend Arthur C. Clarke, I think, was trying to tell us in several of his stunning classics, not the least of which is Childhood's End. Remember how that book went?
That's a classic.
Incredible. Now, there's one other data point we have to hit before we go to calls.
All right.
I know we're running late on time, but if I don't do this, I'm going to kick myself in the morning. I sent you a couple of photographs a few days ago.
Richard,
right?
It is the morning.
And what did you see on the photos?
I saw a little tetrahedron.
Exactly. On the official NASA stereo B footage of the interaction a few days ago.
It looked like a floating pyramid.
It was the night that you and I were supposed to be in the studio here in Albuquerque. That night, Stereo B, which is one of these NASA solar spacecraft, took a sequence of video frames across millions of miles from Earth's orbit to about the orbit of Venus. That's the distance that Elenin was from the spacecraft that night, 23 million miles. And it photographed Elenin interacting with the solar wind, this spray of charged particles that's constantly blowing off the sun. And because of this ghostly impingement of this radiation in space around Elenin, suddenly a shape showed up, a geometric figure. Elenin appears to have a tetrahedrally shaped geometric, I can only call it a force field, which is interacting with the solar wind, with hydrogen and free protons and electrons that basically recombine to cause it to light up, kind of like glowing when it hits this screen. That shape, that geometry, is incredibly recursive of the geometry embodied in the trajectory. All those 19.5 numbers are now embodied in the shape of the field around this thing itself, meaning it's not just a Berge bit. It cannot just be a comet. It has to be an actual ship with generators and computers and control, meaning it could do anything from here on. The dates to watch will be when it passes around the sun on the 11th, 9/11, when it is in conjunction with the Earth, which is on September 26th, which is the weekend, George, that you and I are going to be at Kerry Cassidy's Awake and Aware conference.
That's right. I'm going to be there Friday night. You're going to be there Friday and Saturday.
I'm going to be speaking Saturday night for several hours, laying out all of this data and so much more we haven't had time to get into, plus the NASA Vesta mission, which is doing amazing things out in the asteroid belt, which is part of the mega story. And I will be there at the conference all that weekend. If people want to get tickets, by the way, George, I should give people a number, because you can go to the web to awakenaware2011.com for everybody on the web, but we have a lot of the audience that don't have computers. If you want to join us, you simply call in Los Angeles 301-537-2194. That's 301-537-2194 for the Awaken Aware conference in Irvine, California, the weekend that Elenin crosses conjunction with the sun. And if all these numbers are correct, something extraordinary, something even hyperdimensional could happen that very weekend.
All right, let's take some final calls here. But I do have to say, if you believe in extraterrestrial life, there's no reason not to believe that eventually, a huge spacecraft would come to our region, regardless of whether you think we're being visited or not right now. East of